This is part 6 of the BGA FRTOL course 2022. This evening, I'll be doing a short presentation. Andrew will be setting up the breakout groups, and please could you send any questions to Chula. I think that's it. Let's see if we can get going with the presentation. If you give me a moment, I will share my screen and start the presentation. Right, can somebody wave if they're seeing the presentation there? Excellent, thank you very much. So this is about the test. So this evening, at least the stuff that I'm presenting, really is aimed at those of you who want to take the test. Most of the evening, though, will be spent practicing with coaches, so you don't have to be wanting to do the test to do that. So don't worry if you decide you don't want to do the test. Our agenda for today, rather than go through all the things I wanted to tell you about, which was getting very long, what I've done is created a video which I've put on the website today. So if you're going to do the test, you need to go and watch that. It's in the online course section of the website with a couple of other useful bits of information, which I'll tell you about. So that's that. We're going to talk a bit about the process for doing the test. We're going to talk about test routes, and then we're going to go and do some practice. So the supporting material, under the online course section, I'll put up the video of this session, so anybody who hasn't made it tonight can look at that. There's that new video I've just told you about with information you need to know for the test. We've picked up a bunch of things that we are meant to have told you about, which we think we have, but just to make sure, we're going to tell you again. And there's some other stuff that is definitely worth having. Andrew's put together a rather good document about mistakes that other people made last year in the tests. So we got really good feedback from the examiners, and we got really good feedback about the examiners from our students. But we got good feedback from the examiners, and they told us what the common mistakes were, and we've written that up, or sorry, Andrew has written that up in the document, which is definitely worth reading. Additionally, we've put a link to a CAA document called SRG 2160, which is actually an examiner's document, and it tells them for the new test which things are mandatory. So that's worth a look. It'll give you a clue as to what is definitely going to happen in the test, particularly if you do the new STAR test, which we'll come to in a moment. And lastly, thanks to Chris Walsh, who today pointed me at a video which does quite a nice job of explaining what happens when you've got a listening squawk and you infringe airspace. So I've put that on the website. I think it's and in the course materials in part 5 under all the flying reporter videos. So that's worth a look if you want to see what's happening. I found it quite interesting. The first half was sort of just about people going flying, but it got interesting in the second half. It's not very long; it's only 8 minutes or something. But I found it quite interesting to see what actually the air traffickers were doing when I talked to them, because I don't usually see that. So worth a look. All right. Getting a FRTOL as a glider pilot. You can have a FRTOL attached to your SPL at no extra cost. So if you're going to go and get an SPL, if you've got one now, you can add it, we think. Or if you're going to get a new SPL, you can get it on that. Andrew, is it true that, I can't remember, did we end up with people getting an SPL and then immediately sending it in to get the FRTOL added to it? I can't remember.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, fine.
We don't yet seem to be in a position where you can convert your gliding certificate to an SPL and get the FRTOL at the beginning. Okay. The CAA are under some churn, so these things change month by month. But so that's probably the process. Then you get your SPL, then you can add the FRTOL to it, or you can get a standalone FRTOL where
there's a piece of paper which is just the FRTOL. The number to remember is 24 months, which means that you can have the tests and they last 24 months before the results are invalid and you have to do them again. So at least theoretically, you can do the theoretical knowledge test and then wait almost 24 months before you get the practical test. I really wouldn't advise that. You do have to do the theoretical knowledge test before you do the practical test. That is one of the conditions. So a little bit about the process. You need to be 16 to get the license, but we have had people do the tests prior to being 16. So that's not a problem. You need to speak English to what's called ICAO level 6, which means native speaker standard. If you're not a native speaker, there are other arrangements for people, but you'll need to check with us about that, and we'll point you at the RT examiners to find out exactly what those are. You're going to need a course completion certificate based on what you've done here. What we'll do is we'll use the CAA SRG, is it 1124, Andrew? Oh no, 1171, so I've got it here, 1171. And we'll get the coaches to sign that off to say that you're ready for tests. So that's quite a good check. We did something very similar last year. You have to sit 2 tests. There's a theoretical knowledge test, which is most of the time 12 questions, multiple choice. That's if you do it with an RT examiner. I think if you go do it through an ATO, it's 10 questions, and they'll be slightly different questions. But the most likely route that you're going to use is that you'll do it with the RT examiner. And then you've got one of 2 types of practical test. There's the old style and the new style. The old style is one that right at the moment, pretty much all the RT examiners have to do. You pretend to be in a light aircraft, you taxi, take off, fly a route and land. You're probably using a simulator called RANT, which they will explain to you. It's based on a very small number of possible routes, and you're not allowed generally to use a crib, an aide memoir. Or the thing that's being introduced pretty much as we speak is the new style test, and glider pilots can pretend to be in a glider for the new style test. So they can start after a launch from a non-radio airfield and then do the route, probably divert somewhere and land. And after that, they can cover the TMG and powered RT, so the takeoff, land, taxi sort of stuff, in a discussion with the examiner. And in that test, you are allowed to use a crib. Now, the crib has this sort of information on it. So there's actually nothing that you haven't covered and you shouldn't know. So it's the initial call, the full call, the formal position report, or procedural position report, as we call it, the emergency call, and the VHF direction finding. For me, it's the emergency call that would be useful for that one. If you want to go ahead and do the tests, here's what you need to do. I will be sending out an email in the next day or 2, which will invite you to tick a box if you want to do the test. I'll be sending an email to coaches as well, and we very much like them to volunteer to help. And what we're going to do is we're going to put together groups of students with particular coaches, generally geographically. So as much as we can, if you've got a coach at your club, we'll allocate you to that coach. You need to practice with the coach, then you can book a test, and then you can apply for the FRTOL. The practice, you've essentially got some study groups. So there'll be groups of you, you'll know who you are, and you can work together on the various practice routes that we provide. The coaches are there to help you when you need it, but not to drive you, not to make you do the work, not to do the work for you. So we don't want you to overload them. But you can practice in pairs, you can use script rehearsal, you can go back through the videos and the learning material we've given you. You can talk out loud, do it as you're walking the dog, whatever. And when you think you're ready, get your coach to sign you off as ready for test. And our advice would be to try and do that within 4 or 5 weeks. And we're only asking for commitment from the coaches for that sort of period, something like 4 or 5 weeks, starting in a week's time. It's not an open-ended commitment. The test routes we've given you, I've added to the ones on the website. You've got practice routes 1, 2, and 3, which are designed around the new style tests, so they're pretending to be a glider, and practice routes 4 and 5, which are more old style tests. Really, there's not a huge amount of difference. Even if you're pretending to be a glider, they will give you altitudes to fly at, pretty much mostly so that they can be sure that you're going to go through a particular piece of airspace at the right altitude. So you can't say, well, actually, I don't have to call the max because I'm way above it. They'll tell you you're at 2,500. You can assume you're at 2,500 feet when you enter. For your practice today, I suggest you work on practice route 1. Okay, so that is pretty much all I have to say, which gives us the opportunity to take questions.
Great, so I've got some. Paul, I've sent you a message. Could you just have a read of it? Well, I'll just go through the rest.
Please, can you post here the link to the lessons learned document Andrew circulated or attach it, please?
Yeah, Tim was asking for it. I couldn't quickly see it and read messages and listen.
It's on the website. It's on the online course part of the website.
Okay, so Tim got that. It's on the online course part of the website, apparently.
I'll just.
Okay, let me just start with some of the questions. So while you're just looking at that, Paul, I'll just start. Gary says, Cat 413 mentions Wessex 1010. I assume that means Wessex QFE, is it? No, there are altimeter setting regions like Cotswold, London, Barnsley, and so forth. So Wessex is, I think, a made-up one. So it's the regional pressure setting.
Wessex is real, I think.
Oh, is it? Is it real?
Yeah,
I'm not sure. I've never been down there. Okay, fine.
Yeah, so if I can just expand on that, because it's important.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that people dropped if you look at the documents. Actually, I'll show you briefly. So here's the... Yeah. Have you got a little map on the screen there?
This looks like the Lars.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so this is the online the online course part of the website. This is part 6 of the exam. This is the presentation I talked about, which you need to go and read. And here at the bottom are the 2 links. So this is the document, which is the list of errors, and here's the SRG 2160 that you can look at. So regional pressure settings, which you need to understand. And if you don't understand them, go back to the bronze material to find out.
Paul, it's not in the bronze material. We don't teach this at bronze.
You do not? You don't? Okay, I thought
no,
you did.
No
okay.
Regional pressure settings not taught at bronze. So this is why it's definitely worth talking about.
So I'll talk about it a little bit. So different pressure settings. We can have QFE, which is height above an airfield basin. We can have QNH, which is height above mean sea level. But the Royal Air Force use another one, and they have big areas called altimeter setting regions, which you can find on the map, which have names like Chatham or Wessex, or I think I'll probably remember another one if I try hard. And that has a pressure, which is a forecast QNH. It's the lowest QNH for an hour, forecast an hour ahead. So they will give you, if you call a MATS, they will quite often give you the regional pressure setting. So you'll call them up and they'll say Wessex 1012. And the response to that is to repeat Wessex 1012. It's going to be a bit safer than the actual QNH. And the Air Force use it because they flash around in fast jets at low level and they need to have a safe QNH if they have to pull up into cloud. But they will give it to us. So you need to remember to repeat the name and the number. I don't like them very much, and there's a very good reason for not using them, which is that if you're trying to stay clear of airspace, you need the actual QNH, not the regional pressure setting. But you need to understand the regional pressure setting, and it will come up in the, or it's very likely to come up in the exam. Okay, sure.
Yeah, and the real takeaway is repeat what the controller says.
Yeah.
And that's kind of all you have to know for the, well, you might get questioned on it, but that's the key starting point. Okay, next one is from John, a question about ATIS frequencies, and notices that it can't be obtained on the restricted selection on glider radios. True enough, you can't. So you would have to do it by phone as you propose. So there's not much more to say about that, John.
But in practice,
no.
You need to know about ATIS frequencies for the test.
Yeah.
And if you were flying a powered aircraft into somewhere with an ATIS, there would be an expectation that you would dial up the ATIS and find that information. Or if you were getting airborne from there, that you would use the ATIS to find that information. In a glider, I wouldn't ever bother trying to get the ATIS. So in real life, if you were diverting into somewhere, they'd tell you what you needed to know.
Right. Steve says, the notes say contact Bryce zone, the frequency card sends contact radar first. So if you are going through Bryce zone, they want you on the zone frequency. However, I suspect the frequency card says to contact radar first because the zone frequency isn't always monitored.
No, it's not that. Bryce is a bit special. The zone frequency is the one you need for a crossing. The approach radar frequency is the one that you would get a LARS on. So if you were flying around and getting a LARS, you'd start with the radar frequency. And then if you subsequently wanted to cross the zone, you would use the zone frequency to get that. As a glider, if I'm flying around in my glider, I'm probably not going to get a LARS, but I might get a crossing service and I go straight to zone for that.
On the frequency card, it does actually point out that there is an M, which is for the MATS crossing frequency.
Okay, thanks. Reading the next one from Paul. I have an elderly FRTOL issued 1992, unused some time, without an English language proficiency certificate. Can I just add the ELP to the FRTOL? I think you add it to your license. It's not as a whole. It's not just to your FRTOL. So I'd say read the CAA website, but that you don't you don't have to go and do the radio test again if that's really what lies behind the question.
No, you'll need to get the language thing signed off, and you'll be able to get the FRTOL renewed without testing.
Is it right that they're changing the way the test is run? Yes, Paul's just talked about that to some extent, and I've heard it's going to get a lot harder after April. I've no reason to believe the standard's going to change. It's just that there are different ways of doing the test, e.g. you can simulate being in a glider. Tim, we've answered Paul's answered your question about where the feedback from the tests are. Ben says, is the test at a set date or do I need to book it when I'm ready? I think Paul probably covered that, but I may have been reading. So your coach will sign off the form, I think it's a 2117, to say that you're ready for the test. So that's the short answer to that, Paul.
Yeah, it'd be, if you've got a bunch of people at your club, and depending on where it is, if you can travel to where the examiner is, then because he's local, that will work. But if you're going to get him or her to come over to you, then batch it up, have 4 or 5 people. Tudor, what's a reasonable number of people to do in a day?
Well, on the old system, I'd say three or 4 max.
Okay, so batch up in that, and then it'll be, you can do a deal of some sort.
Yeah. What are the advantages and disadvantages to having a standalone versus a FRTOL attached to a license? I don't think it matters, frankly. But it goes on, the question goes on to say, if I attach a FRTOL to an SPL, does that mean I can no longer use it in a paraglider or microlight, etc.? Answer, no. Answer, no.
So when you say no, it doesn't mean that.
It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that. You've got
you have a FRTOL.
Yeah.
You have a FRTOL.
Do you know if anyone's used VATSIM or similar add-ons for learning RT? Yes, I'm sure people have. I've heard it mentioned. Or in general, are there?
Yeah, VATSIM is basic. I think that's mostly Americanisms.
Yeah.
Don't use it to learn RT.
No, I wouldn't. But if that wasn't the question,
because you won't pass a test by doing it.
No. Or in general, are there any other learning aids that might be useful? Do you know there is so much on the website that Paul and Andrew have put together? I think that'll do, frankly. And the other thing I would say as an examiner is get together with someone else and practice. That's really all there is to it. Do we have an annotation for old versus new test types? And is there any difference? No, you won't have it. No, you'll just get a FRTOL. Provided you're at standard, you'll just get a FRTOL. And it's valid for any type of aircraft. So that question. Does a standalone FRTOL, no SPL, have a cost? I think it's £77.
Yeah, can I say something about cost? Because I meant to do that.
Yeah.
This course is free. We've done our best to reduce the cost to you. Examiners will charge you for doing the test, order of £100. It will depend on the examiner. You'll have to negotiate that with them or see what the different charges are. And the CAA will charge you to get, if you do a standalone FRTOL, they'll charge you about 85 quid, which is about what they're going to charge you to get an SPL. So there's a couple of fees to pay to go through this process, but you can minimize them by taking the FRTOL at the same time as your SPL.
Okay. Jack D says, so if airspace is defined as an altitude, do you need to get a QNH from the relevant airport within that airspace? And then goes on to talk about some specifics in Scotland. The answer is yes. For the reason Paul said, if you're flying underneath a TMA or some such, then use the local QNH from e.g. Aberdeen on your example. I imagine the airports within that will coordinate so that there'll be just one number. I'll be brought next. Sorry, someone wants to comment on that?
Yeah, sorry, Joe. Doesn't that risk breaching the airspace if you're underneath the corridor?
No, if you use the QNH given by, say, Aberdeen, not that I know anything about Aberdeen, then it doesn't. The risk is if you use the regional pressure setting that Paul described the military using.
Yeah, because that'll be, because that's more conservative.
Yeah,
that can be 3 or 4 or 5 millibars, whichever way around it is, more than the actual QNH. So if you use the regional pressure setting and go up to the airspace bottom, you will be in the airspace. That's the thing. That's why you don't want to use it.
Yeah.
A risk of causing confusion. I was thinking flight levels, and those are working on the standard pressure setting.
Yeah. Okay. If the airspace is defined as flight levels and you've switched to the standard pressure setting, there's no problem.
Yeah.
But this is if you're flying on QNH.
Okay, so Steve says I'll be abroad for the next 2 weeks, unable to practice, but want to do the test. Will that work? Yes, that one's not going to slow you down. It might, I don't imagine if the question's about the local coaching groups getting set up, I'm sure that's going to take a week. The worst case is you'll miss one session. I'm not going to know the answer to this one. I had a wireless telegraphy license with my PPLA in the early 90s. I haven't used either since the mid 90s. Is it right that I can just get the radio license renewed? I don't know. If anyone knows the fact on that, then please chip in. I suspect you can. Mm. Is there a cost of adding a FRTOL to an existing SPL? I believe the answer is no. I think that was covered. Does an LAPL S work the same as an SPL? I don't know the answer to that.
I know the answer to that. Your LAPL S is an SPL. It is deemed to be an SPL. When the FCL stuff started, we had two things. We had a LAPL S and we had an SPL. But that all changed when we had SFCL, sailplane flight crew licensing, and the two got merged into one. So if you get an SPL now, you can only get an SPL, you can't get a LAPL S. But if you had a LAPL S or if you have the old style SPL, they're both new style SPLs now by definition.
Good, that's the last of the questions. Thank you all very much. Andrew, are we about ready?
Yes, we're about ready. There's somewhere out there is a coach who is not assigned to a group, but the only way I know to find out is we start the groups and then I leave Paul to mop up the mess I've left behind.
Thanks, Andrew.
And Paul, just before you start mopping, are there any last remarks, Paul, from you?
I don't think so.
Because we won't. I think this is our last.
Can I just say one thing, just to make sure everyone's absolutely clear on this? Over the next several months, FRTOL examiners, such as Chula, will be converted from the old system to the new system. before they have been converted, they can only administer the old style exam where you're pretending to fly a Cessna. After they've been converted, they can administer the new style exam where you can choose to pretend to fly a glider. So it does somewhat matter which examiner you choose if you want to do the new style exam. If you want to do the new style exam, you must be careful to choose an examiner who has been converted to the new system. That problem will go away in a year's time when all the examiners have been converted, but for the next 12 months, you need to pay attention to that.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Tudor. I have enabled screen sharing, so I think all the coaches will be able to share screens. Oh, let me just enable chat as well.
Just look at your chat, Paul.
So I think now you'll be able to chat in the breakout groups as well.
Paul, just check your chat.
Sorry, go on.
Just check your chat.
I think you might need to kick off the breakout groups, Andrew.
I think I do. So just the usual request. Please remember the number of the breakout group that you're in. So if you have to go back up the top level and get Paul to fix things, that gives him a head start. And I apologize, I'm pretty sure when we press the button, there will be a coach who is not assigned, and probably a few students. And as I say, Paul will have to mop things up.
If you, after a minute or two, end up being dropped into a completely different group, my apologies, but it happened last week because we had some quite imbalanced groups. So I evened them out a bit. So that might happen to you. Don't worry about it if that happens, just run with it. This is the difficult bit of the whole process. Off we go.
Okay, folks, and Paul, assign me to group 18, please.
Yeah, I've got that.
Thanks. Okay, see you soon, folks.